My kids haven't eaten in 3 days. Can you buy my wedding ring? A starving widow whispers to a lonely rancher in the dead of winter. The rancher stares at the trembling children on his porch, and suddenly the snow isn't the coldest thing in Colorado. What begins as a desperate plea for bread becomes a battle for survival. Because the debt-hungry storekeeper in town doesn't just want payment, he wants her land, hay, and he'll forge any paper, bribe any badge to take it. Inside the glow of a one-room cabin, prayers rise with the crackle of firewood. But outside, jail keys rattle and boots thunder across frozen ground. The widow's ring was meant to buy food. Now it may cost her freedom. And the rancher, long silent and broken, must decide stay hidden in the shadows or fight with truth against lies that could destroy them all. When greed rules the law, can mercy and faith still win? Or will a mother's sacrifice be buried beneath the snow? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The winter wind howled outside Patrick Hale's cabin, rattling the shutters like angry fists against wood. Inside, the rancher stood alone at his rough-hewn table, breaking day-old bread for his evening meal. The cabin's silence wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, broken only by the crack and pop of pine logs in the fireplace. Knock at the door made him freeze. Out here, 20 miles from town, visitors were rare as gold nuggets. Patrick's weathered face tightened as he crossed to the door, each step heavy with reluctance. The knock came again, weaker this time. He yanked the door open, ready to chase off whatever trouble had found him. But the sight before him stole the harsh words from his throat. A woman stood there, her thin shawl fluttering in the bitter wind. Behind her huddled 2 children, a boy and a girl, their faces pale as new milk. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice catching. "I'm Maya McBride." Her trembling fingers worked at something on her left hand. Children they haven't eaten in 3 days. Patrick watched, stone-faced, as she held out a simple gold band. The firelight caught it, making it shine like a tear. Would you buy my wedding ring?" His jaw clenched. He'd seen desperate folks before, heard sob stories that turned out false as fool's gold. The war had taught him that lesson well enough. "Ma'am, I don't." A soft thud cut him off. The boy had stumbled, catching himself against the doorframe. His sister swayed like a reed in the wind, her small face drawn with hunger. "Eli," Maya gasped, reaching for her son. But the girl Ruth was already falling, her eyes rolling back. Patrick moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the floor. The child weighed nothing in his arms, light as a bundle of dried flowers. "Get inside," he growled, his gruff voice hiding the sudden tremor in his heart. He carried Ruth to the fireplace while Maya helped Eli through the door. The boy's boots scraped against the floorboards. Too weak to lift his feet proper, Patrick laid Ruth on his old chair closest to the warmth. Her face was the color of tallow with blue shadows under her eyes. Maya knelt beside her, smoothing back Ruth's dark hair with shaking hands. "Stay put," Patrick ordered, though they looked too weak to do otherwise. He strode to his kitchen shelf, gathering what he had: half a loaf of bread, some beef broth he'd made yesterday. Not much, but it would have to do. He warmed the broth quickly and set it before them with the bread. The children's hands trembled so badly they could barely hold their spoons. Eli tried to eat slowly, but hunger won out. Both children gulped their food like starving wolves, tears mixing with the broth. Maya sat rigid in her chair, her wedding ring clutched tight in her fist. She didn't reach for the food, though Patrick could see hunger sharp in her face. Pride, he reckoned. Or maybe a mother's instinct to ensure her little ones ate first. The silence in the cabin grew thick as molasses, broken only by the sound of spoons scraping bowls and the winter wind's moan. Patrick stood by the fireplace, his shadow long against the wall. Every protective wall he'd built since the war screamed at him to send them away come morning. Helping folks only led to pain. He'd learned that lesson hard. But watching Ruth's color slowly return, seeing Eli's shoulders finally relax as his belly filled, Patrick felt something crack inside his chest. Something he'd thought long dead and buried in a battlefield grave. Maya's eyes met his across the fireplace. They held no begging, no false gratitude, just the raw truth of a mother who'd swallowed her pride to save her children. The wedding ring glinted in her clenched hand, a small circle of gold that probably meant more to her than any meal. Patrick cleared his throat. "Keep your ring, ma'am," he said gruffly. "Ain't right to take a widow's wedding band?" Maya's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I can't accept charity, Mr. Hale. I won't." "Ain't charity," he replied, turning to stare into the fire. "Just decency. Something this world could use more of, I reckon." The flames danced before him, casting warming light through the cabin that had been cold and empty for so long. Behind him, he heard Ruth's soft sigh as she drifted to sleep, her belly full at last. Eli's spoon clinked against his empty bowl, and Maya's quiet thank you floated like a prayer in the winter night. Patrick stood at the fireplace, feeding another log to the hungry flames. Behind him, Maya tucked a threadbare blanket around her sleeping children. Ruth and Eli lay curled like kittens near the hearth, their faces peaceful now that their bellies were full. The rancher's thoughts churned like creek waters in spring. Flood. For years he'd lived alone on this land, keeping the world at arm's length. Solitude had become his shield, silence his constant companion. Yet here he stood, his quiet cabin invaded by strangers who stirred memories he'd rather forget. He watched Maya from the corner of his eye as she smoothed Ruth's dark hair. Her movements were gentle, but her hands bore the marks of hard work calluses. From ranch tools, tiny scars from needle pricks. Her dress, though clean, had been mended multiple times, the patches carefully sewn to match the original fabric. Her boots were worn nearly through at the soles. The sight of those boots twisted something in Patrick's chest. He remembered his own mother's hands, patching and mending, making do during lean times. The war had taught him to mistrust, to see danger in every outstretched hand. But there was no deception in Maya McBride's desperate offer of her wedding ring, only the raw courage of a mother fighting for her children's survival. Night deepened outside the cabin windows. The wind's howl softened to a whisper, and snow began to fall in thick, silent flakes. Patrick added more wood to the fire, his movements quiet so as not to wake the children. Maya had dozed off in his old rocking chair, her face drawn with exhaustion. Even in sleep, dawn came with steel-gray light filtering through frosted window panes. Patrick rose early, as was his habit, and set about making breakfast. The coffee pot bubbled on the stove while he mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt. Soon, the smell of fresh cornbread filled the cabin. Maya stirred at the sounds and scents of morning. She sat up straight, smoothing her skirts with embarrassed hands. "Mr. Hale, coffee's hot," he interrupted, pouring a cup and setting it before her. Her fingers curled around the warm tin cup, but she didn't drink. Instead, she pulled out her wedding ring again, holding it out with trembling determination. "Please, for the food and shelter. I insist." Patrick looked at the small gold band catching the morning light. In his mind's eye, he saw another ring, buried with his mother after father's death. She'd never removed it, not even in their poorest days. He reached out, but instead of taking the ring, he closed Maya's fingers over it. "Keep it," he said gruffly. "Your vows are worth more than gold." Tears welled in Maya's eyes, but she blinked them back. "We've imposed too much already. We should go." Storms still blowing. Patrick cut in, gesturing to the windows where snow swirled thick and white. Stay, just until it clears. The children woke to hot cornbread and milk. After breakfast, their strength returned. They grew restless in the cabin's confines. Patrick found himself leading them to the barn, watching. As their eyes widened at the sight of his horses and chickens, "Can I help?" Eli asked, trying to deepen his voice to sound older. His small shoulders squared with determination to be useful. Patrick handed him a bucket. "Chickens need feeding." He showed the boy how to hold the pail steady while scattering. Corn, how to check for eggs without spooking the hens. Ruth followed behind them, giggling when the chickens pecked around her feet. The simple tasks filled the morning hours. Patrick demonstrated how to brush down the horses, letting Eli handle the curry comb while Ruth stroked their velvet noses. Maya helped gather eggs, her capable hands making quick work of the task. Something shifted in Patrick's chest as he watched them work. The barn felt different with their presence warmer somehow, despite the winter chill. The children's laughter echoed off the rafters, mixing with the familiar sounds of animals and daily chores. He caught himself almost smiling when Eli successfully filled the chicken's water trough without spilling a drop. The boy's proud grin reminded Patrick of himself at that age, learning ranch work at his father's side. That memory, usually painful, felt softer now, wrapped in the simple joy of passing on knowledge to eager hands. The day wore on, marked by shared tasks and quiet moments. Patrick found himself speaking more than he had in months, explaining the workings of his small ranch to Eli's earnest questions. Even Ruth's shy smiles began to crack through his practiced distance, while Maya's quiet competence reminded him of the comfort in working alongside another capable adult by afternoon. The familiar routines of ranch life had taken on a strange new warmth. Patrick stood in the barn doorway, watching Maya and the children tend to the evening feeding. The feeling of dead things awakening continued to stir in his heart. Like spring thaw breaking winter's grip, the lantern cast warm shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn table as they gathered for the evening meal. Patrick had added extra potatoes and carrots to his usual stew, making it stretch to feed four. The children ate with better manners now that desperate hunger had passed, though Eli still sopped up every drop with his bread. Maya stirred her bowl. Slowly, her shoulders tense. "I should explain why we came to your door, Mr. Hale." Her voice was quiet, but steady. "My Thomas C. was helping the Wilsons fix their roof last spring. The boards were slick from rain." She paused, pressing her lips together. "He didn't survive the fall." Ruth's small hand crept into her mother's. Maya squeezed it gently before continuing. "We had credit at the Mercantile, Jack Cray's store. Thomas always meant to settle up come harvest, but after she swallowed hard. Mr. Cray started pressing for payment right after the funeral." Patrick's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Jack Cray. The name hit him like a fist to the gut. He'd heard plenty about the storekeeper's dealings, though he'd kept his distance from town affairs. Cray had a way of turning simple debts into nooses, especially for widows with prime land. "How much does he claim you owe?" Patrick asked, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. $230. Maya's fingers twisted in her apron, but the ledger didn't seem right. "Thomas was always careful with our accounts. Mr. Cray says he has papers showing purchases I don't remember making." Patrick grunted. He'd seen Cray's methods before, legitimate debts padded with imaginary purchases. Interest piled on interest until honest folks couldn't keep up. The storekeeper had tried similar tricks with Patrick's nearest neighbor last year, aiming to seize their water rights. "He visited last week," Maya continued. "Said if I couldn't pay by month's end, he'd take the homestead as settlement." Her voice cracked slightly. "It's not much land, but it's all we have. All Thomas left us." Eli's face darkened at Cray's name. "He scared Ruth's chickens last time. kicked at them when they got near his fancy boots. "Hush now," Maya said, "but—" Patrick noticed how her hand trembled as she reached for the water pitcher. The meal finished quietly. Patrick stood to add wood to the dying fire, his movements mechanical as his mind churned. Behind him, he heard the children's whispered voices from their nest of blankets near the hearth. Mama Ruth's soft voice carried in the quiet cabin. "Could we stay here? Mr. Hale has lots of room. Ah, and I could help with the horses," Eli added eagerly. "I'm strong enough." "Children," Maya's whisper was gentle but firm. "We can't assume anything. Mr. Hale has been very kind, but this isn't our home. Nothing is certain right now except that God will show us a path." Patrick pretended not to hear as he arranged the logs. But the children's words followed him to his cot in the lean-to room where he'd insisted on sleeping, giving the family his bed. He lay rigid in the darkness, memories he'd long buried rising like ghosts. The war had taught him harsh lessons about getting involved in others' fights. He'd seen too many good men die trying to right wrongs that weren't their concern. When he'd claimed this isolated ranch, he'd vowed to keep to himself, tend his own affairs. Let the world's troubles pass him by. But Maya's quiet dignity and the children's trust gnawed at his conscience. He knew Cray's reputation, how the man had built his power through such schemes, taking advantage of folks when they were most vulnerable. The storekeeper had tried to pressure Patrick into various dealings over the years, but Patrick's self-sufficiency and fierce reputation had kept him at bay. Now, by sheltering Maya and her children, he'd stepped into Cray's sights again. The storekeeper wouldn't take kindly to anyone interfering with his plans for the McBride homestead. Patrick had spent 4 years avoiding town feuds, building his walls of solitude stone by stone. One act of mercy threatened to bring those walls crumbling down. He shifted on the narrow cot, the thin mattress crackling with corn husks. Through the cabin's wall, he could hear Ruth's soft breathing and Eli's occasional murmur in his sleep. The sounds tugged at something long dormant in his chest, reminding him of nights in army camps when men would whisper of home and family, of things worth fighting for. Patrick stared into the darkness. The war's hard lessons, wrestling with older memories, his father's voice, saying a man's word was his bond. His mother's quiet insistence that none of God's children were meant to stand alone. Sleep eluded him as past and present tangled like roots in rocky soil, forcing him to question everything he'd built his solitary life upon. Morning light crept across the frozen pasture as Patrick adjusted the cinch on his bay gelding. Frost crunched under his boots while he secured empty flour sacks to the saddle. His morning chores had revealed his supplies running low. A trip to town couldn't be delayed. No matter how much he dreaded it, he glanced toward the cabin where Maya stood at the door, her shawl pulled tight. The children peered around her skirts, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Patrick cleared his throat. "Reckon you ought to come along." The words felt rough in his mouth. Best face. Cray, sooner than later. Maya's fingers twisted in her shawl, but she nodded. "You're right, Mr. Hale." Patrick helped Ruth onto the horse first, then Eli. Maya mounted behind them, gathering her skirts. Patrick took the reins, leading them on foot. The horse's hooves broke through the snow crust with hollow sounds. As they set out on the long journey to town, the winter sun climbed slowly as they traveled. Patrick maintained a steady pace, mindful of his passengers. Eli pointed out rabbit tracks in the snow while Ruth hummed softly, her small hands buried in the horse's mane. Maya remained quiet, her face drawn with worry the closer they got to town. By midday, weathered buildings came into view. The town sprawled along the railroad tracks: general store, saloon, telegraph office, and church, all dusted with snow. Patrick helped Maya and the children dismount in front of Cray's Mercantile. The store's window displayed gleaming tools and colorful cloth, a deceptively welcoming sight. Maya straightened her shoulders before entering, though Patrick noticed her hands trembling. A bell jingled as they stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and tobacco. Jack Cray looked up from his ledger, his practiced smile spreading across his clean-shaven face. "Why, Mrs. McBride?" Cray's voice oozed false warmth. I was beginning to worry. His eyes flickered to Patrick, then back to Maya. "Come to settle your account, I hope." Maya lifted her chin. "Mr. Cray, about the debt $230, Cray interrupted smoothly. He moved around the counter, too close to Maya. Though we might arrange more favorable terms, his smile turned predatory. A woman alone has other ways to work off what she owes. Patrick stepped forward, his shadow falling across Cray. The storekeeper's smile faltered as he took in Patrick's full height and the hard set of his jaw. "Well, if it isn't Patrick Hale." Cray retreated a step, adjusting his vest. "Don't often see you in town these days. Not since the war, as I recall." Patrick said nothing, but his presence was enough. Cray's manner shifted to artificial politeness. "Just discussing business with Mrs. McBride." He turned back to his counter. "But debts always come due, one way or another. You understand that, don't you, Mrs. McBride?" Maya gathered the children closer. "We'll take 2 pounds of flour. Mr. Cray, I can pay for that much." Cray measured the flour with exaggerated care, his movements precise and sharp. Patrick paid for the flour himself, laying coins on the counter with deliberate slowness. The sound of metal on wood rang in the tense silence. Outside again, Maya's shoulders sagged with relief. The ride home was quiet, broken only by Ruth asking about supper and Eli naming the few winter birds they spotted. Maya responded to her children with gentle assurance, though Patrick could see the worry hadn't left her eyes. That evening, after the family had gone to bed, Patrick sat at his table with his ledger open before him. The leather-bound book showed careful columns of numbers cattle sold, supplies bought, savings stored away. He counted his coins by lamplight, the stack smaller than he'd like. Years of solitude had taught him to live lean, but protecting Maya would demand more than he'd planned to spend. He rubbed his temples, studying the figures. The numbers stared back, cold and unchanging as winter stars. Any stand against Cray would cost him not just in coins, but in the peaceful isolation he'd built his life around. The question was whether he was willing to pay that price. Through the cabin wall, he heard Ruth cough in her sleep, followed by Maya's soft murmur of comfort. The sound settled in his chest like weights on a scale, tipping against his carefully constructed solitude. The snow fell in steady waves across Patrick's ranch, blanketing the world in hushed white. Morning brought the familiar crunch of boots on fresh powder as Patrick made his way to the barn. The routine of ranch life continued. Hay needed hauling, animals needed feeding, and the water trough required constant attention to keep it from freezing solid. Inside the cabin, changes emerged like tender shoots through spring soil. Maya moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, stirring cornmeal mush for breakfast and darning socks by the afternoon light. Her skilled fingers pulled needle and thread through worn fabric, making old things whole again. The children adapted to their temporary home, finding ways to be useful without being asked. Eli shadowed Patrick's every move, his small boots leaving tracks alongside the rancher's larger ones. "Let me help, Mr. Hale," became his daily refrain. Patrick found himself adjusting his stride, slowing his movements so the boy could match them. At the woodpile, Eli planted his feet wide, gripping the splitting maul with determination. Like this, Patrick demonstrated, his weathered hands adjusting Eli's grip on the tool's handle. "Keep your back straight." The boy's face scrunched with concentration as he helped stack the split logs. Pride shining in his eyes with each armload, carried Ruth stayed close to her mother, a quiet presence in Maya's shadow. She hummed softly while helping to sweep the cabin floor or fold the few clothes they owned. Her small hands learned to pat biscuit dough and scatter feed for the chickens. Tasks that brought rare smiles to her solemn face. The days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Patrick found himself watching the family when they didn't notice Maya's gentle way with Ruth. Eli's earnest attempts at manly tasks. The way the children's hollow cheeks slowly began to fill out with regular meals. One evening, as steam rose from bowls of rabbit stew, Maya cleared her throat softly. "Shall we say grace?" she asked, her voice gentle but carrying an underlying strength that caught Patrick off guard. The children immediately folded their hands, heads bowed in practiced reverence. Patrick stared at his bowl, something long forgotten stirring in his chest. How many years had it been since he'd bowed his head in prayer? The war had stolen his faith, along with so much else. But Maya's clear voice filled the cabin with familiar words of thanksgiving, and Patrick found his chin dropping to his chest. The simple prayer opened a flood of memories he'd walled away. His mother's voice rose from the past, singing old hymns. While she worked, the way she'd taught him to thank the Lord for every blessing, no matter how small. The peace he'd once known in those moments of devotion, before gunpowder and blood had scorched his belief in anything holy. After the children were settled in their corner for the night, Maya approached Patrick's chair by the fire. Her hands twisted in her apron as she spoke. "Mr. Hale, I know we've imposed far longer than we should." She glanced at her children, who were playing a quiet game with smooth stones they'd collected. "I want to thank you for letting us stay these extra nights. I've noticed your shirts need mending. Perhaps I could repair them. It's not much, but..." Patrick studied the flames, pipe smoke curling around his head. The offer of mending stirred something unexpected, not pride or offense, but a warm recognition of Maya's dignity. She wouldn't accept charity without giving something in return. "Reckon they could use some attention," he said gruffly, nodding toward his worn shirts. A soft laugh drifted from the children's corner, drawing his attention. Eli was showing Ruth how to stack the stones in tiny towers, their heads bent together in concentration. The sound of their muffled giggles filled spaces in the cabin Patrick hadn't known were empty. He puffed on his pipe, watching the domestic scene unfold before him. Maya settled in the chair opposite, her needle flashing in the firelight as she began mending his shirts. The familiar evening sounds crack of the fire, whisper of thread through fabric. Children's quiet murmurs wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Something shifted deep within Patrick's chest, like ice breaking up on a spring-swollen river. The walls he'd built since the war, meant to keep out pain, had also kept out simple joys, a child's laughter, a woman's grace, the comfort of shared prayers. Now those walls were developing cracks, letting in glimpses of warmth he'd forgotten existed. A week passed, and winter's grip loosened enough for Patrick to tackle necessary repairs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted yard as he gathered tools from the barn. Eli hovered nearby, practically bouncing with excitement when Patrick motioned for him to climb into the wagon. "We're mending the north pasture fence today," Patrick explained, loading wooden posts and coils of wire. "Time you learned proper fence work." The boy's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir." He scrambled onto the seat, clutching his worn coat tight against the morning chill. They rode in comfortable silence, the wagon wheels crunching through crusty snow. Patrick stole glances at the boy, seeing how Eli sat straighter, trying to mirror his posture. At the fence line, they found several posts loosened by winter frost, wire sagging between them. "First rule of fence mending," Patrick said, demonstrating, with careful movements, "is setting your posts solid." He showed Eli how to tamp the earth firm around the base, explaining each step. The boy absorbed every word, his face serious with concentration. "Now for the wire," Patrick continued, unwinding a length of gleaming metal. you want it tight, but not so tight it pulls your posts askew. He guided Eli's small hands, showing him how to stretch the wire just right. These staples here, you got to hammer them careful-like. Split the wood and all your works for nothing. Eli's tongue poked out the corner of his mouth as he positioned a staple. His first strike went sideways, but Patrick steadied his hand. That's it, gentle but firm. The next blow landed true, and Eli beamed at the praise. You're a natural. Boy, Patrick said gruffly, watching pride color Eli's wind-chapped cheeks. Back at the cabin, Maya and Ruth had been busy with their own tasks. The main room was warm with cooking smells, sage and onion from the bubbling stew pot, yeast from fresh-baked bread. Ruth sat cross-legged by the hearth, carefully stitching patches onto a worn quilt while Maya worked on another. When Patrick and Eli returned, stamping snow from their boots, the cabin welcomed them with warmth and good smells. Maya ladled thick stew into bowls while Ruth proudly displayed her needlework. Eli couldn't stop talking about the fence mending, demonstrating his hammering technique. With an imaginary tool, the peaceful evening routine was interrupted by a knock at the door. Patrick's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but Maya's soft gasp of recognition made him pause. In the doorway stood Tahu, an Apache scout known in the territory. His dark eyes took in the scene, the family at supper, Patrick's defensive stance, the children's curious faces. He remained on the threshold, showing proper respect for Patrick's home. I heard Maya McBride was here, Tahu said, his voice measured and clear. I knew her husband. Patrick's stance remained stiff, but Maya stepped forward. Yes, I remember. You helped Thomas when the water disputes began. Tahu nodded solemnly. Your husband stood with us when others would take Apache water rights. He understood the land belongs to no one man. His eyes met Patrick's. Now I hear Jack Cray threatens. His widow's claim? Kaya's fingers twisted in her apron, but she held her head high. He says we owe debts. Cray twists paper words like snakes, Tahu replied. I offered to watch your land, keep eyes on men who might harm your claim. He gestured to the darkness beyond the door. I know every trail, every ridge. What I see, I can tell you. Patrick studied the scout's face, recognizing the honor in the offer. He'd heard tales of Tahu's reliability, how he balanced duties to his people with work among the settlers. The scout's steady gaze held no deception, only the weight of a promise, Maya spoke softly. Thank you. Thomas always said you were a man of your word. Patrick's shoulders slowly relaxed. Here was an unexpected ally, one who understood the territory's unwritten laws better than any paper deed. Storm's coming, he said gruffly, stepping aside. Best you stay the night. Tahu inclined his head in acceptance. Ruth shyly offered him a bowl of stew, which he received with grave courtesy. They gathered around the fire, the unusual group bound by common cause protecting a widow's claim against those who had twisted the law to their advantage. As the evening deepened, Patrick watched Maya serve their guest with quiet dignity. She showed neither fear nor prejudice, only gratitude for this extension of friendship. The children, too, seemed to sense the importance of the moment, listening intently as Tahu spoke of their father's fairness in the water disputes. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, new trust bloomed like early spring flowers through winter's crust. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. Maya stood at the cabin window, watching pink light touch the snow-covered peaks. She turned to Patrick, who sat cleaning his boots by the fire. The church bell will ring soon, she said softly. We haven't missed a Sunday service since Thomas passed. Patrick's shoulders tensed. Haven't stepped foot in that church for 15 years. He kept his eyes on his work, rubbing the leather with steady strokes. Eli and Ruth looked up from their corner, where they'd been playing with wooden blocks Patrick had carved. "Please, Mr. Hale." Ruth's voice quavered. "Mama always says that singing makes her heart lighter. And Reverend Mills gives out peppermint sticks sometimes," Eli added hopefully. Patrick's hands stilled on his boots. Maya watched him wrestle with himself, saw the way his jaw clenched and unclenched. Finally, he stood with a sigh that seemed to come from his boots. "Reckon the wagon needs hitching then," he muttered. The children scrambled to get ready, pulling. On their newly mended coats, Maya wrapped her shawl tight and helped Patrick hitch the horses. The wagon wheels creaked and crunched through the crusty snow as they made their slow way toward town. The little wooden church stood proud against the winter sky, its white paint gleaming. Smoke curled from the chimney where the deacon had lit the potbelly stove hours before. Patrick tied the horses, then hesitated at the steps. Maya touched his arm gently. "We can sit in the back." Inside, the wooden pews were filling with townspeople in their Sunday best. Patrick chose the last row, his body rigid as a fence post. The children settled between him and Maya, their eyes wide at the colored lights streaming through the simple stained glass. When the organ wheezed to life, Maya's voice rose clear and true with the opening hymn. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Ruth joined first, then Eli, their small voices growing more confident. Patrick kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, but his fingers tapped slightly against his knee. The familiar words washed over them. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Patrick's throat worked as he swallowed hard. Maya noticed his eyes growing damp, though he blinked the moisture away quickly. After the service, people filed past, some nodding politely, others staring openly at Patrick Hale sitting in church with a widow and her children. Outside, Jack Cray stood across the street with Marshall Carter, their heads bent close in conversation. Jack's sharp eyes followed them as they loaded the wagon, his whispered words making the marshal frown and nod. But the morning's peace couldn't be broken so easily. On the ride home, Maya suggested having neighbors over for coffee. To her surprise, Patrick agreed. By late afternoon, the cabin buzzed with life. Sarah Jensen brought her famous apple pie, while the Wilsons arrived with fresh cream for the coffee. Eli proudly showed Tom Wilson how he'd learned to mend fence, while Ruth demonstrated her quilting stitches to Sarah's daughters. "Your boy's becoming quite the ranch hand," Tom said to Patrick, who stood by the fire nursing his coffee. "He's got a good head on his shoulders." Patrick replied, watching Eli explain the proper way to hammer fence staples. Something almost like a smile tugged at his mouth. Maya moved among the guests, pouring coffee and serving thick slices of cornbread. The cabin filled with the scent of coffee and wood smoke, punctuated by laughter and conversation. Children played in corners while adults caught up on news, sharing stories of winter's trials and spring's promise. "It's good to see light in these windows again," Sarah Jensen said quietly to Maya. "This place has been too lonely too long." Maya watched Patrick showing Tom Wilson his ledger books, his usual stiff posture relaxing as they discussed spring cattle prices. The children's laughter rang from the kitchen where they snuck extra pieces of apple pie. Warmth filled her chest that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. For one evening, the ranch felt alive again. Music from Ruth's borrowed. Fiddle mixed with the clink of coffee cups and the murmur of friendly voices. Patrick's cabin, so long a fortress of solitude, had become a gathering place where hope bloomed like early flowers through winter's crust. As the sun set, turning the snow to gold, neighbors bundled up to leave. The children waved from the porch until the last wagon disappeared down the snowy track. Inside, Maya found Patrick standing in the middle of his transformed home, looking almost dazed by the lingering warmth and cheer. "Thank you," she said simply. Beginning to clear away coffee cups, Patrick nodded, that almost smile touching his face again as he watched Eli and Ruth falling asleep by the fire, their faces still sticky with apple pie. Patrick woke before dawn, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor as he moved about the cabin. A quiet tune escaped his lips, Amazing Grace, though he barely noticed he was humming it. The familiar melody brought memories of yesterday's church service, warming him despite the morning chill. Maya stirred from her pallet near the fireplace, where Ruth and Eli still slept deeply. She watched Patrick kindle the morning fire, noting the unusual lightness in his movements. "The coffee smells wonderful," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter as she joined him by the stove. "I want to thank you again for letting us stay. These past weeks," her voice caught. "Oh, you've shown such kindness to me and the children." Patrick poured coffee into 2 tin cups, steam rising between them. "Reckon the place feels more like home with folks in it." He paused, studying the dark liquid. "But I can see something's troubling you." Maya's fingers tightened around her cup. "It's the debts to Jack. They hang over us like storm clouds. Even with your generosity, I don't see how we'll face it together." Patrick cut in, his voice firm but gentle. "Whatever Jack's planning, you're not alone anymore." The morning sun had climbed to midday when they heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Patrick moved to the window, hand tensing near his rifle, then relaxed slightly as he recognized Reverend Mills's bay mare. The preacher dismounted in a rush, his usually calm face creased with worry. "Patrick, Maya, God," he called, hurrying to the porch. "Thank the Lord you're both here." They met him at the door, the children appearing behind them. The Reverend removed his hat, twisting it in his hands. "I came as soon as I heard. Jack Cray filed papers with Marshall Carter this morning. He's claiming Maya sold him her homestead to cover Thomas's debts." "What?" Maya's face went pale. "I never signed anything." "How dare he? He's got documents with your mark on them," Reverend Mills said gravely. "The marshals already validated them." Patrick's face darkened like thunderclouds gathering. "Those papers are forged. Jack's been working this scheme on widows for years, but nobody's stood against him. The marshal supports Jack's claim." The Reverend continued. "They're saying Maya has 3 days to vacate her property." Maya sank into a chair, her children rushing to her side. "But that land, Thomas and I built every fence, planted every tree. Our memories are there, our life's work." Patrick's jaw clenched as he paced the cabin floor. "Jack's gone too far this time. I've watched him steal land before, staying quiet." Like everyone else, he stopped, turning to Maya. "Not anymore. We'll expose his lies." "But how?" Maya whispered. "It's his word against mine, and he has the marshal in his pocket. Then we'll find proof." Patrick's voice carried the hard edge of steel. "Jack's not as clever as he thinks. Men like him get careless, make mistakes. We just have to find them." The Reverend nodded slowly. "I'll ask around town, quiet-like. Some folks might talk to a preacher when they won't talk to others." As afternoon faded to evening, Patrick sat at his workbench, methodically sharpening tools. The steady scrape of stone against metal filled the cabin. Maya knelt by the fireplace, her children pressed close against her sides as she prayed in a low voice. "Lord, give us strength to face what's coming. Protect these little ones. Help us find a way through this valley." Eli watched Patrick with worried eyes. "Are we going to lose our home, Mr. Hale?" Patrick paused in his work, testing a blade's edge with his thumb. "Not if I can help it, boy. Sometimes a man has to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." Ruth sniffled against her mother's shoulder. "I'm scared, Mama. I know, sweetheart." Maya stroked her daughter's hair. "We're not alone anymore. God hasn't forgotten us, and neither has Mr. Hale." The cabin, so recently filled with neighborly warmth and laughter, now felt heavy with foreboding. Patrick resumed his sharpening, each stroke deliberate and focused. Maya's prayers continued softly in the firelight, her children's arms wrapped tight around her waist. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. Inside, 4 souls huddled close, bound together by injustice and the determination to fight it. The tools gleamed in the lamplight as Patrick worked, preparing for whatever battle lay ahead. 2 days crawled by like molasses in winter. Patrick stood at his cabin window, watching dust rise on the road leading to his ranch. 3 riders approached Marshall, Carter flanked by 2 deputies, their badges catching the morning sun. Patrick's hand moved toward his rifle, but he forced it back to his side. Maya looked up from where she sat mending clothes, her fingers going still on the fabric. "Children, go to the back room," she said quietly. Eli and Ruth hesitated, but obeyed, their small boots scuffing across the wooden floor. The marshal's heavy knock rattled the door. Patrick opened it, filling the frame with his broad shoulders. "State your business, Marshal." Carter's mouth twisted into a smirk. "Step aside, Hale. We're here for the widow McBride." He pulled a document from his vest. "Got papers here saying she committed fraud. Forged signatures on property documents. That's a lie." Maya stood, her face flushing with anger. "I never signed anything. Jack Cray fabricated those papers himself." "Now, ma'am," one deputy drawled, "your word against." "Mr. Cray's don't carry much weight. He's a respected businessman." The marshal pushed past Patrick, his spurs jingling against the floorboards. He grabbed Maya's arm roughly. "You're coming with us." "Show me proof," Patrick demanded, his voice like gravel. "Real proof, not Jack's." "Fancy paperwork," Carter scoffed. "I don't answer to you, Hale. The law's the law." The children burst from the back room at the sound of struggle. "Mama!" Ruth screamed, tears streaming down her face. Eli tried to rush forward, but Patrick caught him. "Please," Maya begged as the deputies dragged her toward the door. "My children should have thought about them before you tried cheating." "Honest folks," Carter sneered. Patrick's hand found his rifle again. One shot could end this. But he saw Maya's eyes meet his, pleading. Violence would only bring more trouble down on them all. With bitter restraint, he lowered the weapon. The children's cries pierced the morning air as the deputies forced Maya into their wagon. Dust swirled around the wheels as they drove away, taking her toward town and whatever cell Jack had waiting. Patrick stood in the doorway long after they disappeared, his fists clenched at his sides. The children huddled together on the floor, their sobs quieter now, but no less heartbreaking. Evening settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Patrick sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they might hold answers. Ruth had cried herself to sleep on his cot, while Eli pressed against Patrick's side, hiccuping with occasional tears. The door opened softly. Tahu entered his moccasins, silent on the floor. He took in the scene with dark, knowing eyes. "They took her," Patrick said, his voice hollow. "I just stood there and watched." "Fighting would have brought worse," Tahu replied, settling beside them. "But this is not the end. What else can I do?" Patrick's words came out bitter as gall. "Jack owns the marshal. The law's on his side. The law is not always justice." Tahu's hand rested on Patrick's shoulder, steady and warm. "Do not give up. Hope. There are other ways to fight." Patrick continued, staring into the flames, feeling the weight of Tahu's words. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows on the wall. Eli sniffled beside him, and Patrick's arm tightened around the boy's shoulders, in the dancing flames. Patrick saw Maya's face, her dignity, even as they dragged her away. Her courage in protecting her children until the last moment. He thought of Jack Cray, sitting smug in his store, thinking he'd won again. The marshal, betraying his badge for a few coins. His jaw tightened. Tahu was right there, had to be another way. The fire reflected in Patrick's eyes as his resolve, hardened like steel in a forge. He might have failed Maya today, but tomorrow was another matter entirely. Ruth whimpered in her sleep, and Eli pressed closer to Patrick's side. These children trusted him now. Maya had trusted him. He couldn't let that trust be in vain. The night grew deeper, but sleep remained far away. Patrick sat vigil by the fire, the children beside him, while Tahu kept watch near the window. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the dark prairie, their cries echoing the despair that filled the cabin. Dawn painted the Colorado, sky in streaks of pink and gold as Patrick hitched his wagon. His movements were precise, deliberate, masking the worry churning inside him. Eli and Ruth watched from the porch, their faces drawn with fear after a sleepless night. "Miss Sarah will look after you today," Patrick explained, helping them into the wagon. "She's got fresh bread and maybe even some honey." The children nodded without speaking. The short ride to his neighbor's homestead passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the soft nickering of horses. Sarah Miller, a grandmother whose kindness showed in the wrinkles around her eyes, welcomed them at her gate. "These little ones will be safe with me," she assured Patrick, gathering Ruth and Eli close. "You do what needs doing." Patrick touched the brim of his hat, his throat tight. He'd never asked favors before, had prided himself on needing no one. Now everything had changed. Tahu waited at the crossroads, mounted on his painted pony. The Apache scout's face was composed, but his eyes held determination. They rode toward town together, hooves drumming a steady rhythm on the packed earth. The church stood empty, except for Reverend Thompson, who looked up from his Bible as they entered. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through high windows. "I've been praying for Maya," the preacher said, pulling out Jack's papers. "These documents troubled my spirit from the moment I saw them." Patrick spread the papers on a wooden pew, his calloused fingers tracing Maya's supposed signature. He'd seen her hand in the family Bible she carried neat, careful letters that spoke of her schoolteacher past. This signature sprawled differently, too hurried and sharp. "Look here," Patrick said, pointing to the date. This was signed 3 weeks after her husband died. She was still deep in mourning then, barely leaving her cabin. Tahu leaned closer, his dark eyes narrowing. "The ink is fresher than that date would allow." The preacher nodded slowly. "Jack's always had friends at the land office. That young clerk, Jenkins, I've seen them speaking close, and Jenkins started wearing better clothes soon after." Patrick and Tahu exchanged glances. Without a word, they mounted up and rode to the land office, a small building that smelled of dust and old paper. Jenkins sat at his desk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers. His face paled when they entered. "We need to speak about Jack Cray's business," Patrick said quietly, standing close enough that Jenkins had to crane his neck to look up at him. I don't know anything about," Jenkins stammered, but Tahu's silent presence by the door made him swallow hard. Patrick leaned down, his voice low. "A woman's in jail. Her children are crying for her, and you know the truth." Jenkins' hands shook as he opened a drawer. "He'll kill me if he finds out," he whispered, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. "But I kept records. Every false paper, every bribe. Insurance, you might say." Patrick took the ledger, feeling its weights, the weight of truth, of justice, maybe. "Your name stays out of it," he promised. "But this ends now." The ride back to Patrick's ranch was silent, the ledger secure in his saddlebag. Evening settled over the land, painting long shadows across the prairie. Inside his cabin, Patrick lit a lamp and sank to his knees beside his bed. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with disuse. How long had it been since he'd prayed? Since Before Gettysburg, at least. I ain't been much for talking to you lately. Maybe I was angry or just lost. But there's folks counting on me now." The lamp flame flickered, casting warm light on the rough walls. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the darkening land. "I need strength," Patrick continued, his hands clasped tight. "Not for fighting, I've done enough of that. But strength to stand for what's right, to protect those who need protecting." Tahu's soft footsteps approached from the doorway. He didn't speak, respecting the sacred moment, but his presence offered silent support. "Amen," Patrick finished. Rising slowly, the ledger sat on his table, its pages holding the key to Maya's freedom. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, for the first time in years, Patrick felt the peace of knowing his path was true. Morning frost coated the jail's iron bars as Patrick approached, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. His boots echoed on the wooden sidewalk, each step measured and purposeful. Inside, the cell block smelled of coal, smoke, and despair. Maya sat on a thin cot, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. Her face brightened at Patrick's approach, though exhaustion shadowed her eyes. The marshal lounged at his desk, pretending to read a newspaper while watching them sidelong. "Brought you something warm," Patrick said softly, passing a tin of steaming coffee and fresh biscuits through the bars. His fingers brushed Maya's as she took them, and he felt how cold her hands were. "The children," she whispered, rapping her fingers around the warm tin. "Safe with Sarah Miller. They miss their mama something fierce." Patrick's voice grew husky. He glanced at the marshal before continuing more quietly. "But we found something, Maya. Something that'll set things right?" He pulled the leather ledger partway from his coat, letting her glimpse its worn cover. Maya's eyes widened as Patrick explained in low tones about Jenkins' records and Jack's forgeries. "The truth's all here," he murmured. "Every crooked deal. Every false paper." Maya reached through the bars, clasping Patrick's rough hand in both of hers. "I knew God wouldn't abandon us," she whispered, tears glazing her eyes. "I've been praying, Patrick, for strength, for justice for you." The marshal's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, swaggering over. "Mighty touching," he sneered, tapping his badge. "But the law's the law, and that paper Jack showed says clear as day that paper's a lie." Patrick cut in, drawing himself up to his full height. The marshal, unused to being challenged, took a step back, and soon everyone will know it. "That sounds like trouble talk, Hale." The marshal's hand drifted toward his gun. "No trouble," Patrick replied evenly. "Just truth, and it's coming, whether you and Jack are ready or not." Maya squeezed his hand once more before letting go. Her quiet dignity in the face of injustice made Patrick's heart ache. "I'll be back," he promised, holding her gaze. "Keep faith." Outside, the winter sun had climbed higher, glinting off fresh snow. Patrick mounted his horse and rode through town, stopping at selected homes and businesses. At each place, he shared what he'd discovered, showing Jenkins' damning records. The baker's wife gasped at the proof of Jack's schemes. The blacksmith's weathered face darkened with anger. The schoolteacher nodded grimly, remembering other widows who'd lost their land under suspicious circumstances. Tahu, meanwhile, moved like a shadow through the scattered ranches and camps surrounding the town. He spoke to Apache families who'd seen their water rights stolen, to Mexican vaqueros who'd lost grazing lands, to homesteaders who'd suffered under Jack's grinding interest rates. The scout's quiet words carried weight, backed by the evidence in Jenkins' ledger. By afternoon, a current of resistance hummed through the community. Farmers paused in their fields to talk in low voices. Women gathered at wells, sharing what they'd heard. In the saloon, cowboys and miners muttered over their drinks, recalling times they'd witnessed Jack's cruelty as dusk settled over the land. Patrick returned to Sarah Miller's homestead. He found Eli and Ruth kneeling beside their borrowed bed, their small faces serious in the lamplight. "Dear God," Eli began, his young voice trembling slightly, "please help Mama come home soon. Help Mr. Patrick show everyone the truth. And keep Mama warm," Ruth added softly. "She gets cold easy, especially her hands." Patrick stood in the doorway, his throat tight. These children had endured so much hunger, fear, losing their father, now their mother imprisoned. Yet here they knelt, their faith unshaken. "Please watch over Mr. Patrick too," Eli continued, "and Mr. Tahu and everyone helping us." A tear slid down Patrick's weathered cheek before he could brush it away. How long had it been since anyone had prayed for him? The children's simple words pierced the armor he'd built around his heart since the war. "Amen," Ruth finished, looking up to see Patrick. She smiled shyly. "Mama says God always hears us, even when it takes time to see his answer." Patrick nodded, not trusting his voice. He tucked them in, marveling at how these two small souls had worked their way into his life. Their quiet breathing soon filled the room as they drifted to sleep. Outside Sarah's cabin, Patrick gazed at the stars scattered across the dark Colorado sky. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight hope burned bright as those distant lights. The ledger rested heavy in his coat pocket, its pages holding the power to right so many wrongs. He wasn't alone anymore. The whole community stood, ready to demand justice for the first time in years. Patrick felt the strength that comes from standing with others against darkness. Maya's faith, the children's prayers, Tahu's loyalty, and the townspeople's awakening conscience had transformed his solitary path into something greater. Market day dawned crisp and clear, the February sun casting long shadows across the town square. Wagons and riders converged from all directions, drawn by Patrick's urgent message. The old church hall, its wooden walls weathered by decades of Colorado winters, filled steadily with farmers in patched coats, ranchers still dusty from the trail, and townsfolk bundled against the morning chill. Patrick stood at the front. The leather ledger and forged deed laid carefully on the preacher's lectern. Reverend Thompson, his silver hair catching the light from high windows, stood beside him. The air hummed with whispered conversations and the creak of wooden benches. "Folks," Patrick began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "I called you here because what happens to one of us happens to all." His fingers traced the edge of the documents. Maya McBride sits in jail while her children cry for her. But her story ain't just about one widow. He lifted the forged deed, holding it where sunlight streamed through colored glass. This paper claims Maya sold her land to Jack Cray, says she signed it after her husband died. Patrick's weathered face hardened. But look here at the truth. The church door banged open. Jack Cray strode in, his fancy vest stretched tight across his chest. "This is slander, Hale," he shouted, face flushed. "You're spreading lies about a legitimate business deal." "These numbers tell a different tale," Patrick replied steadily. He opened Jenkins' ledger, its pages filled with careful columns. Every crooked loan, every seized property, all recorded right here. Reverend Thompson adjusted his spectacles, leaning over the books. These entries show pattern after pattern of altered dates, inflated interest. His finger traced down a column. Land transferred through suspicious means, debts multiplied without cause. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah Miller stood up, her voice sharp with memory. "Just like what happened to my sister last spring. Lost everything after her husband passed." The marshal pushed through the doorway, hand resting on his gun. "Belt, this here's an unlawful gathering. Time to disperse, folks." No, the word came from dozens of throats. Farmers rose from their seats, ranch hands crossed their arms. Women who'd lost homes to Jack's schemes stepped forward. You moved from the shadows where he'd been watching. His quiet voice commanded attention. I knew Thomas McBride, he said, naming Maya's late husband, when others would deny us water. Rights. He spoke for fairness. Said the law must protect all people, not just the powerful. He looked directly at Jack. His widow deserves that same justice. Patrick set his rifle against the wall, the gesture deliberate. I ain't here to fight. With bullets, he declared. Truth is weapon enough. He turned to the assembled townspeople. How many of you have lost land to mysterious debts? How many have seen neighbors driven out by papers they never signed? Hands raised across the hall. Jack's face had gone pale beneath his bluster. The marshal's fingers twitched near his holster, but he looked uncertain now, seeing the determination in so many faces. I demand you arrest him for disrupting the peace. Jack pointed at Patrick, his voice cracking. Seems to me the only disruptions. Been to your schemes? Came a gravelly voice. Old Pete Anderson, who'd lost his south pasture last year, stood up. Time folk knew the truth. The truth, Jack sneered. The truth is, you're all nothing without me. I built this town's commerce. I extend credit when times are hard. You prey on grief, Patrick corrected quietly. You wait until folks are at their lowest, then strip them of everything. More voices joined in, sharing stories of suspicious loans, altered contracts, threats veiled as business terms. The marshal began backing toward the door, reading the changing winds. This is how justice starts, Patrick continued, his voice steady. Not with violence, but with people standing together. Maya McBride's case ain't just about one widow's home. It's about every family that suffered under greed, dressed up as law. The crowd erupted in support. Free Maya, someone shouted.
Others
took up the call. Jack's face twisted with rage and fear. You'll regret this, Hale. All of you will. He spun on his heel, shoving past the marshal in his haste to escape. But his threats fell hollow against the solid wall of community that had finally risen against him. Farmers clasped hands with ranchers. Apache families nodded to settler neighbors. Women who'd lost homes embraced those who still had them. Patrick watched it all, feeling the weight of isolation falling away from his shoulders. This was what Maya's faith had seen possible. Not just justice for one family, but healing for an entire community. The morning sun climbed higher, pouring through the church windows like liquid gold, illuminating faces bright with purpose and unity. The truth had been spoken, and there would be no returning to shadows. The crowd from the church marched as one toward the jailhouse, their footsteps crunching in the morning frost. The marshal, his confidence crumbling, fumbled with his ring of keys. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the winter chill as dozens of determined faces watched his every move. Best do what's right, Marshal, Reverend Thompson said firmly. The truth's been shown plain as day. The cell door creaked open. Kea stepped out, her shawl drawn tight, dark circles beneath her eyes from sleepless nights on the hard bunk. But her spine was straight, her dignity unbroken. Mama, two small voices rang out. Eli and Ruth burst through the crowd, throwing themselves into their mother's arms. Maya dropped to her knees, gathering them close, tears streaming down her face, as she kissed their heads again and again. My babies, she whispered, my precious ones. Patrick stood back, his chest tight with emotion as he watched the reunion. The morning sun caught Maya's dark hair, making it shine like copper wire. When she looked up and met his eyes, the gratitude in her gaze made his heart stumble. Word spread quickly through town that Jack Cray had been seen throwing belongings into his buggy, cursing as he fled. His fine house stood empty, his store locked tight. His power, built on lies and fear, had crumbled in the face of united truth. That evening, lantern lights spilled from every window of Patrick's ranch cabin. Neighbors crowded inside, bringing dishes of food and warm embraces. Sarah Miller hugged Maya tight, whispering words of support. Old Pete Anderson taught Eli a harmonica tune, while Ruth helped Mrs. Thompson arrange biscuits on a cleaned plank table. The preacher's wife started a hymn, her clear voice rising above the chatter. Others joined in, the familiar words of Amazing Grace filling the once lonely cabin with harmony. Maya's voice soared sweet and true. Her children pressed against her sides. Patrick stood by the hearth, watching the scene with wonder. This morning, he'd spoken truth against injustice. Now, looking at the faces glowing in lamplight, faces of people who'd stood together, who'd chosen right over fear, he felt something profound shift inside him when Reverend Thompson called. For evening prayers, Patrick didn't hesitate. His voice joined the others, steady and sincere. Lord, we thank you for justice done, for community restored, for hope renewed. Maya turned toward him as he spoke, her eyes shining. In that moment, as their gazes met across the crowded room, Patrick saw more than gratitude in her face. He saw possibility, promise, and a future he'd thought forever closed to him. The cabin rang with laughter and song, transformed from a hermit's refuge into a home filled with light and life. Outside, stars scattered across the Colorado sky like diamond dust, bearing witness to justice done and hearts renewed. Morning sunlight painted the snow-covered pasture in shades of gold and rose. The crisp air held the promise of a warmer day, though frost still crunched beneath Patrick's boots as he worked at mending the broken fence line. His gloved hands moved with practiced ease, weaving wire between weathered posts. The sound of laughter caught his attention. Eli and Ruth trudged through the snow, each carrying a bucket of water from the well. Their cheeks glowed pink with cold and effort, but their smiles shone bright as the morning sun. They'd grown stronger these past weeks, no longer the gaunt, frightened children who'd collapsed at his threshold. Maya's footsteps whispered across the snow as she approached. She wore the shawl he'd given her, pulled tight against the morning chill. The golden light caught her wedding ring as she adjusted it, making the simple band gleam like a star. "I've been thinking about this ring," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "When Thomas died, I thought it only meant loss and sorrow. But now," she touched the band gently. "Now I see it different. It reminds me that love survives. That vows can mean more than just between husband and wife. They can mean loyalty to family, to community, to doing what's right." Patrick set down his tools, moved by her words. "Your faith showed me the way back," he admitted gruffly, a tea I'd forgotten. There was more to life than being alone with memories. Uncle Patrick, Uncle Patrick. Eli's voice rang across the pasture as he and Ruth bounded toward them, empty buckets swinging. The word uncle caught in Patrick's heart, warming him more than any fire could. Ruth crashed into his legs, hugging tight, while Eli tugged at his sleeve. "Can we help with the fence?" Eli asked eagerly. "I remember how you showed me to set the wire just right. I'll to learn too." Ruth chimed in, her small face earnest. Maya's hand found Patrick's, her fingers warm despite the cold. He squeezed gently, marveling at how natural it felt now. This simple human contact he'd denied himself for so long. Together. They walked toward the cabin, the children racing ahead through the snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight already glowed in the windows, turning them to squares of honey gold against the weathered logs. The sight struck Patrick deeply. No longer just shelter, but a true home. Filled with the warmth of family and faith, his steps faltered for a moment as emotion welled up. Maya's hand tightened on his understanding in her touch. The lonely rancher who'd hidden from life had vanished like morning mist. replaced by a man who'd found his heart again through sacrifice, courage, and the power of genuine love. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.